We're getting into our first start-to-finish project coming up on JC's Rip Track. Hi there, my name's John and welcome to JC's Rip Track. If you're looking for tips and advice on how to transform your plastic models into something that you'd see on the rails today, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon and you'll be on your way. After hitting 1,000 subscribers, my discussion tab suddenly became a community tab, and that allowed me to have a number of different options in terms of ways to communicate with you. You're probably getting post updates whenever I put something up. One of the very first things that I did was post a poll as to what sort of videos you'd like to see. The one that came out on top was start to finish videos. Also, just recently, I've created a Patreon page as a way for you to become actively involved in the creative process. And please go over to the Patreon page and check it out, and it'll explain the whole process there. But one of the results that will come out of that is more of these start to finish videos that my Patreons will be providing. Now, this particular car that I'm going to be working on today was an early commission that I did last summer, and you've seen some of the footage from it from the Weathering Basics video. However, it doesn't show the start to finish of any of the cars that I did in there. The car that I'm going to be working on in this video is a Canadian Pacific Hopper. This one used to be under the Canadian Wheat Board before it was disbanded and linked to CP Rail. And in this case, it is still in service, and there are a number of pictures out there. And when I was doing some of the research for it, there was a really neat weathering pattern on it. One of the things that I like to do when working on a car is, of course, research the prototype. But the way that I like to approach it is that it's a problem to solve. My Weathering Basics process is something to get you started, but really when it comes down to it, each car is different and should be treated differently. And even the cars that I used in my Weathering Basics videos, I did approach each car just a little bit differently. Let's go over to the workbench and have a look. In this next section, all I'm doing here is removing the trucks, but because I was doing a number of different cars at the same time, using a white gel pen, it was helpful to write CPWX on the bottom of each truck as I was taking them off, so that when I was to assemble them at the end of it, I would know which truck went with each car. To start with, I wanted to do a satin coat, just to give it a little bit of something that I could give a little bit of tooth to, because I was going to do a several stage fading process with this. And a simple satin coat at this point would provide just the kind of nice blend that I would want to work with this particular model. In this case, I used 10 parts Future to 1 part flat base to give this a satin coat. Now in this clip, it looks much glossier than it ended up being. This is one of the cases where I went out of sequence from my normal weathering process. And that's one of the things when working on a model, you try to tailor things to the model itself. In this case, I needed some chipping on the logos itself before I did any amount of serious fading. Now, originally I started with a brush, but ultimately I settled on using a sponge for this. The brush kind of helped with a few key spots that I needed to tailor this in, and I did use that. And it's primarily around these wheat logos for this, and I would do this eventually on both sides. But after starting with a brush and just doing a couple spots, and partly this was also to test the color, to make sure that I got the match right, because in this case I was using a mixture of various Games Workshop reds, mostly Mephiston red, cut with Wild Rider red, I believe Squig orange. And so I was just testing this in by using the brush, and then once I was happy with that, it was much easier at this point to move in and start using the sponge. As you can see, I mixed the paint up a little bit to get the paint color right, and just mix it around and keep testing it on the model using a brush. And once I'm happy with that, that's the point at which I bring the sponge and I then do the sponge. And then once you have the sponge, it actually goes by quite quickly. My fading process in this was going to be a 2-stage process. I would fade with an airbrush, and in this case, I just simply used a light gray for the mix,
spraying on the upper parts of the model. There really isn't that much in the way of fading on the prototype relative to what some of the other parts are going to take care of, but still the upper parts were definitely lighter. And one of the things I wanted to pay attention to is that the black walkways in particular, that's where the gray would help the most. Now, I did deliberately do a little bit of overspray onto the upper parts of the model itself, but eventually the dot fading technique, which is what I would move on to shortly after this, would take care of that. But as you can see, I'm primarily focusing my fading on the black parts, in essence, to make the black, as a previous video said, not so black, and then the weathering itself would show up a little bit better. So there is some overspray in the upper areas, but this otherwise was what I needed to do. Once this part of the fading is done, I'm preparing it to do the dot fading technique. When working with oils, particularly when doing something like the dot fading technique, you really want to use a gloss coat over the model because it'll receive the oils well, the oils will behave well with it, and this really makes this part of it work. It's a very quick process using Future floor polish. I thinned it 1 part Future to 1 part denatured alcohol, and it was time to work on the dot fading technique.
Due to some of the limitations that I have with the camera that I'm working on, the dot fade technique unfortunately didn't get filmed because the camera simply stopped filming before I even got to it. However, I can say that the colors that I used for this red car were white, a parchment color, yellow, red, and believe it or not, green.
What footage I do actually have is just of the tail end of it. I had applied the dots normally as described in my dot fading video, but in this particular case, it's a little blurry, but you can see me trying to work out some of the extra tide marks just at the tail end of the process to bring the fading up. Perhaps one of the things that you'll get sick of me doing is showing how I do a clear coat virtually between every step. This really is important to the weathering process because it does protect the work that you've done. Here I'm using a coat of Future to protect it because the next layer is also an oil layer. I want a smooth, clear acrylic coat in order to get the kind of work that I want to be done with this. So once this was done, I just simply let it dry and then it was on to the next step. Next was to prepare the wash. For both the red cars in this picture, but especially for the Canada car, I decided to use Starship Fill. So this did require me to actually create a wash of my own by using this oil paint. It wasn't too hard. All I had to do was just simply take some of the paint, not very much of it, and mix it in with some white spirit. And for those of you who are curious, that's actually a hobby sculpting tool that I'm using it as a palette knife. It works rather well. It has a dual role, especially if you're using putty, but it works really well for this. Now came time to do a panel line wash. I would end up using the Starship Fill more than once on this particular model. If you look at the prototype pictures, it shows almost this dual rib pattern. But for the first set, I wanted to get all the panel lines on the model done. And that required using the wash that I had made up using the Starship Fill. The process is straightforward. I've already made up the wash, and what I do here is I first wet the model by brushing some white spirit over top of it, by taking a flat brush and just simply brushing over the surface of the model. And I didn't have to do it too much. You want to keep it fairly light when applying this kind of thing. You just want enough so that it begins to collect in and around the cracks and crevices. So then once the surface was wet, I then took the wash and started applying it right into the various crevices, the panel lines all across the model, starting at the top and then working my way down. Although really you can work from the bottom up as well, because this is just to get the panel lines onto the model, but not necessarily to give them any detail. The primary thing is get the wash where it needs to go and let it start to settle into the cracks. And then where you really begin to see it is when I start working on the vertical panel lines. Primarily, what I'm looking for is not the streaking that comes down from where the walkways are secured. I'm interested at this point in providing the actual panel lines that are on the surface of the model itself. And so I would draw the wash up and down the model as I work my way across it. Moving on this session, I just work my way on one side. I then would work my way around the model and doing the ends. The ends don't show as well in this video, but while they were much easier, all I had to do was just simply When doing this kind of wash, you just need to touch the detail, and generally it'll flow where you want and need it to go, but at the same time it does need to be kind of coaxed along. Don't worry if it looks terrible, because this part of it is just the application. You're trying to get the wash on, but because it's an oil, there is also a removal process to this. And so as we complete the panel and work our way across the rest of the model, once I apply everything, I then let it dry, and then I'll be moving on to the next step. After letting the model dry for about 20 minutes, and it's important to set a timer here, it was time to come back to it. And the first thing that I did was to actually take a paper towel and just do some broad smoothing across the model, using some downward strokes, as you can see, just using the paper towel here. Now you can use a lint-free cloth. I didn't have too much trouble with the paper towel, but this got what I needed to have done. It brought out the panel lines in the way that I needed it to, and as you can see, I'm using both downward strokes and some cross strokes. And once I got those in place, I then used a soft dry brush to smooth out the rest of the panel lines and just massage it. This again is more art than science. You just simply work at it until it looks good. The main thing is you don't want hard edges and you don't want brush marks. Those are the two main things that you want to try to avoid. You'll get brush marks if they're still a little too much thinner in what you've already applied, which means you've got to dry off the brush or switch off to a new one. And you're just trying to massage it and soften it. You want to work your way across the whole model. And as you can see here, I'm just slowly working my way and coming back and forth until I'm happy with it. The main thing is you want to soften it to get it just right. And once I've done one side, I just simply work way around the other parts of the model. I didn't get a chance to film this, but prior to do the chipping, I did a clear matte coat over the model. The next part was to do chipping. Now this model didn't have a lot of chipping on it. Earlier I had chipped away a little bit of the logos down to the original paint, but there isn't a lot in the way of rust on this. So primarily I am doing some sponge chipping, but the areas that I'm focusing on are primarily the upper walkways and the hatches underneath. This is why applying the light gray airbrush fade earlier is important, because you can see the chipped effect on this better against a gray background than a black. In this case, the color I'm using is AK Interactive's chipping color. It's kind of a mix between black and burnt umber. I just carefully sponged it across the top hatches as well as the walkways where people are walking, obviously. And it's fairly light, and I'm just working my way across the model. And then once I'm done the walkways on the top, I'm then doing the hatches underneath. In looking at the reference photos, one of the things that is really obvious is that the panel lines are much thicker. This is partway up the model. There were these thicker lines of grime that would accumulate around the panel lines, but instead of just the detail of the panel lines, they were much thicker. So I used the Starship filth, but in this case I used it in a different way, not so much as a wash, but this time applying it directly as full strength oil over the panel lines with just a little bit of thinner rather than as a true wash. With this, that allowed me to get the kind of effect of those thicker lines of grime around the bottom, and eventually that would come down from the top, although that would happen at a later point. But I simply took a small brush, put a little bit of the oil paint directly on it. I would then apply it directly to the lower parts of the panel lines, drawing it up approximately halfway to 3/4 the way up the model. But again, full strength oils this time. This isn't a wash. This is using the oils as the strength, following on the panel lines, just going across the model and applying it that way. This was a fairly lengthy process, but eventually, as you can see here, I just simply did the panel lines about halfway up. But unlike washes, almost immediately I then came back and started to soften the lines using a dry brush, but using a little bit of thinner around the edges and just kind of doing an initial soften up. Because this is oils, I needed to let it dry a little bit more, so I would then let it dry for about 20 minutes once I had finished the initial shaping of the lines, and then it was time to come back to it. After letting them dry for about 20 minutes. Again, they were just a little too much, or they were a little too thick, and I just wanted to soften them a little bit more. So I then came back, the 20-minute did the trick in terms of getting the oils to the consistency that I wanted, and as you can see here, I'm just using a dry brush to soften up these thicker lines and giving them the right consistency that I was looking for. This required a little bit more scrubbing in order to get the lines the way that I wanted them to look. But for the most part, this became really striking because now it's really starting to look a lot like the prototype. Once I had finished this part, I came back and used a clear coat of Future to protect it for the next round that would involve oils again. I would be using the Starship Filth again, but instead of a matte coat, I needed the gloss coat in order to get the streaking that I wanted done. With the clear gloss down, it was time to do the streaks that would come down from where the walkway would attach to the top of the covered hopper. These were different lines. They come down in different angles, and this is really evident in the prototype photo. I would just simply take a little bit of the same Starship Filth oil paint, apply it directly to where the streak would be coming from, move it across the model, and then I would use a flat brush to very quickly draw these down into the streaks that I wanted to, and I just use a brush to continue to shape it in various different ways. Once this was done, it was time to do a matte coat. I used a mixture of 3 parts Future to 1 part Tamiya flat base, and this provided a nice matte coat where it would really display everything. And this protected it and brought the model to a point where I was pretty happy with how it was looking. And as you can see here, this is showing how the model is turning out at this point. The streaks are working the way that I wanted them to. Even though these are all the same color, they're used in different ways and show a different part of the model, and it's making it look much closer to the prototype. And now it was time for the graffiti. In the prototype picture, on one side, there is a significant piece of graffiti, but it's not particularly colorful. It's more like an outline. It seems to be something that a graffiti writer was in process of doing before they had to abandon it for whatever reason. It's partially done, and so using the prototype reference, and I keep a picture of it handy, I started the process by looking carefully at the prototype picture, having it on an iPad close by, zoomed in so I could take a close look at it, and then I used the different frames of references. I marked out the reference points with a pencil to begin with, and then I started sketching out the lines on the whole thing. This, of course, takes a little while to do. In marking out the various reference points and then actually drawing the graffiti on the model with the pencil was the first order of business. I then came back and used a black Micron pen to outline what I had just done in pencil, and then I would be set for the next step. When working with the graffiti at the next point, after using the black Micron pen, I had to come back with a little bit of white. Now, I did use a white gel pen for a little bit to test to see how it worked, but I did find that the gel pen wasn't as effective in applying this. I did some lines here and there. As you can see in the picture here, I did draw some lines against the Micron pen where it seemed to work well, but I found that it wasn't working quite as well as I had hoped. Eventually, what I did is I then continued to use the gel pen for a couple of small things, but I found that eventually I was better to come back with a very, very fine white paintbrush and do the rest of the work this way. So it's not necessarily one or the other, but it's a bit of both. Some people are more comfortable in using gel pens. I'm very comfortable using a very fine paintbrush. This paintbrush happens to be a Winsor Newton Series 7 miniature line 000, so it's a very, very small brush, very accurate, and gives me the kind of results that I'm looking for. Once I had finished working with the white, it was time to come back with the black. Any flat black paint will do, but I tend to use the Games Workshop paints and they work really well. But I had to come back and use the black paint to tighten up the lines. I had to paint over the areas essentially where I had already used the Micron pen just to make it more consistent. But the nice thing is also when you draw this on, you're also tightening up the thickness of the white as well. What I'm trying to do is to get it as close to the prototype as I can. The unique challenge with this particular piece of graffiti is because it was hollow, I did have to be careful to make sure that the surface of the car was still visible in the same way that the prototype pictures were. As you can see, graffiti can take quite a bit of time on any car like this. Now it came time to work on the trucks, and I did all the trucks for all 5 cars that I worked on at the same time, so you're going to see more than just the ones for the CP car. All I did at this point was used a flat clear coat over top of the trucks. Sometimes it's good to get the right color for priming this. I wanted to start with the basic black and then work my way up. And I found the best way, at least for what this was, to start with a flat clear coat. I was using Tamiya Flat Clear, and that seemed to get the job done. When spraying the flat clear on it, I mixed just a tiny little bit of white into the mix to give it a little bit of color so that when I would later apply washes, it would make the details pop. I just continued through, did all the trucks at once, and then it was time to move on to the next step. I wanted to provide a little bit of color, a little bit of dust, dirt, and rust. I wanted to start with the trucks as if they were brand new, as if they were black, and then weather them down from there. So initially what I did was I went through and I painted the springs a rust color in this Mournfang brown, good standard color. Continued to paint that, and I did this for again for all the trucks at the same time. And then, once I had finished that and had let them dry, it was then time to come and do a wash over the whole thing. So I used a color called Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. These are acrylic washes. These are not oil washes, and they have a different consistency and a different result than, say, using an oil wash. Oil washes can be very precise, whereas acrylic washes like this tend to be a lot more general, but they do have a benefit of making the detail pop. The advantage to these ones also is you apply them straight out of the pot. Normally, I like to mix paints and soften them up, but I'm just applying it right over the entire model itself. As with the trucks, I did all the wheel sets at the same time. Painting the wheel sets here, I fudged it a little bit. I mainly wanted to make sure that the surfaces of the wheel sets were the ones that had the weathering on it. I was a little less concerned about the axles because when it's rolling across the track, if you're actually looking at an axle, you've had an accident and it's derailed. That's not part of the model that you're going to be looking at. So perhaps I fudged it a little bit, but I did all of the wheel sets at the same time, and I had put them into the various containers. As you can see, I'm using the caboose in this particular case as an example, but because I did the wheel sets all at once, the process was exactly the same because it was all happening at the same time. The paint that I used, going back to my rust standard of Mournfang Brown, but the difference this time around is not only did I use the Mournfang Brown, but I also used one of my rust weathering powders mixed directly in with the acrylic paint. And the reason that I did this is to give it some texture, that ultimately when it dried, that it would actually have more of a textured feel to it rather than just simply making it look painted. And that's one real advantage where using weathering powders is something that is used and used well. As you've noted, I've not used weathering powders that often, but I did use them specifically for painting the wheel sets in all of the pieces that I did here. And as you can see, as I'm coming together, I just used the Mournfang Brown, which is a base paint, along with a light rust color from Forgeworld, but really any kind of a light rust color would work. You just mix it in with the acrylic paint and then carefully apply it to the wheel. Trust me, this does make a good textured look. And as you paint it around, just make sure it stays off of the running surface of the wheel. Cleaning it up, if you have to, just rub it with your finger because it's acrylic paint. If it does dry, you can use a Q-tip and a little bit of rubbing alcohol to clean that part off. Now, the second last step, after I had finished doing the wheel sets and as they were drying, I then, using a clear flat coat over the entire model to finish it off. You might notice in the pictures here that I had very specifically used a little bit of dark gray paint to paint over the WX part of the CP logo to make it match the prototype. That's representative of the disbanding of the Canadian wheat board. And then this is also reflected on the current state of these cars that were originally wheat board, but then were simply folded into the fleet of used in Western Canada. Once this clear coat was applied, it was time to apply the trucks. The last step, of course, was reassembling the car and putting it all together. What I did first was bringing all the pieces that I had set aside. I put the wheel sets in. Unfortunately, in the pictures that I have here, it's really high in the frame, but just carefully, or in my case, rather clumsily, putting the wheel sets back into the trucks and then reattaching them, screwing them in, but also making sure that they would turn freely, but still enough to hold it on the model. This wasn't too hard of a process. It was just simply making sure that everything is back. And once that is done, then the model is ready to be placed on a layout.
So I hope you found that helpful. If you're looking for tips and advice on how to get the most out of your painting and weathering projects, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon and you'll be notified anytime I upload a new video. Also, please check the links down below for some of the products that were used in this video. You can also look down there for links to my Facebook page, my brand new Patreon page, my Instagram account, and my Twitter account. And these are all different ways that you can connect with me and see the progress of what I'm doing. And so thanks for watching. Good luck, and may you keep on track.